Hello, my name is Alex Emmanuel and I'm studying Level 3 Sports Coaching at North Harts College, and today I'll be doing my presentation on the development and organisation of sport. So, firstly, as I already discussed, I'll be discussing about the development and organisation of my chosen sport, which is football, and I'll be creating like a timeline going throughout like each period during this development, and talking how it impacted the sport, which is football, and different changes throughout the years and time periods. So starting off, we have the agricultural period. This was like a beginning period of industrialization. It was in the 1800s, and obviously agricultural period has to do with farmland, etc. So this was quite a fast economic development for the people back then as well, because you can start growing your own crops, you can then go and sell them, and that's how you used to make money throughout using crops, obviously provide for your family and then sell to other people. And obviously farms had some value because you needed them to grow your crops, etc. So some of the sports that were being played during the agricultural period were mostly things such as fencing and archery, because back in that period sports were mainly used as military purposes, as we can see here. So people usually used to play the sports, like I said, such as fencing and archery, and used to develop different skills that were required in the war. Obviously using bow and arrow, etc., to take out enemies. So that was useful. Obviously it was a sport, but the skills learnt in that sport were useful during a war. So you could always protect your village, etc. So yeah, they were useful for the war. And then there was a divide obviously back then with upper and lower class, and you had the lower class usually used to play the more simple sports that didn't require much money. Obviously they didn't really have much money, the lower class. You had higher class that had all the money. They were the rich people that used to be able to play the more complex sports. So some of the sports that the lower class used to play were things such as knuckle boxing, which was bare knuckle boxing, very violent games usually back then. So that's what was usually given to the lower class. And then you had a higher class used to do wagers and betting on who they thought would win, so they still got a gain out of it. Obviously if you won the bet, you get more money out of it, and you're just seeing the lower class people go head to head and fight against each other. So that was a gain for the higher class. Some of the complex sports that they used to play were things such as real tennis, which was usually played in manors, and then it was big buildings. It was very different to the tennis we know now. It was indoors, and then you could play it with your hands as well, without using a racket, etc. So it was very different, but back then more expensive sport, required equipment that were worth quite a fair chunk. So that's why lower class obviously didn't own the facilities to play either, and didn't own equipment. So that was the more complex sports were given to the higher class. So moving on to the society back then, the agricultural society, it was very religious. So everyone was very close to God, believed in God. Used to pray, etc. And if anything did happen, they would always think, it was God's choice. It was God's choice, and it was for the best. And obviously, like I mentioned before, due to agricultural, linking with farmland, crops, etc., their main income was obviously from crops and farmland. And this was slightly beneficial, I guess, for the lower class because they could grow their crops um, and were able to provide for their families, but also sell it on to make some income, to have some more money for their families, etc. But I'm guessing the higher class got a lot of gain from it because they had the most money, so they could buy as much as they wanted, etc. And maybe even owned farmlands, and just put the lower class to work and grow their crops on there. So it was mostly higher class gain, but there was some lower class gain, like I said. So moving on, we have the Industrial Revolution. So this was like a rapid development of like factories, etc. Different factories being built. Some of the positives you could take out of this were obviously more jobs could have been provided to the lower class people. More factories, more people are needed to work there. Another one, linking in with sport, is there were clubs that started being invented and created, and we have clubs that we know now, big clubs such as Arsenal. We were known as the Woolwich Armaments Factory, so that was obviously how they started, and now they're a big club in the Premier League known as Arsenal. So sport wise, it was quite had a huge impact with different clubs being created. So we now have more competition between different clubs, and it's slightly more professional as well. However, it was not really played in the cities. Sports were not really played in the cities because obviously that's where the factories were, etc. So there are not many facilities to play sport in the city. So it was mostly in the countryside where you had the higher class going out there and doing their archery, playing all their sports, whilst the lower class were working really long shifts in the factories for the higher class, which was a negative on participation for sport for the lower class, since they didn't have much time to obviously play sport because they could have up to like 17-hour shift, and then obviously you'd go home, have a rest, have some food, and then go back tomorrow, get ready for the next day. Sport is not really the first thing on your mind if you're working for that many hours in a factory. Another negative of it was obviously things such as illnesses and diseases being able to be spread a lot easier because there were so many people close to each other. Everyone was compacted together in the factories, so it was a lot easier to spread diseases, etc. And obviously the science back then wasn't as developed as it is now, and things like medicine, etc. and doctors were not as good as they are now, so things like that could not have been prevented very easily back then. So obviously illnesses being able to be spread very easily meant that a lot of people were sick and could even die from it. So this obviously once again lowered participation in sport because more people were getting sick, even dying. So they were either at home trying to get better obviously unfortunately passing away, so they couldn't participate in the sports. Moving on, we have the public school systems. So this was, mainly free public education. This is like free public education for secondary schools and primary schools. And, this back in the day, it was Thomas Arnold who actually had a huge impact on, sport with some of the stuff that he created and put in place. And it increased like the development in sport because it was more structured due to different rules that were put in place. Things such as like mob football, which was obviously back then, very brutal, very violent. There was more of a structure to it, and it definitely became less violent, and there were different rules that changed the game. Some that have even changed the game to what it is now. Such as like you can't use your hands, etc., to carry the ball. And obviously nowadays you don't go from one town to the other to try and score a goal. And on the 11 players on each team. Another thing that was created or put in place back then with public schools were things such as house systems. So obviously looking at it nowadays, you have like things such as like sports day. Sometimes you have your different houses that you're put in, and you compete for that house on sports day, playing different sports throughout the day. And this also created a sort of like a competitiveness in football or like any sport back then that was played, because you play for something now. You play for sort of like a club, and you want to do well, and you want to put your best performance to make sure that house wins. So once again, that helped make sports a lot more structured, and it gave it more of a competitiveness and a bit more professionalism. So yeah, it was a big impact from Thomas Arnold, sports-wise, which was really good. Moving on now to the 20th century. So obviously the 20th century is a time period between the 1900s and the 2000s. So obviously during this time period we had the wars, World War One, World War Two, which actually meant that sports became quite popular amongst the soldiers, who usually used to play them between their combat breaks. So it became slightly more popular amongst the soldiers. However, people such as the lower class didn't really have that much of participation in it or popularity, because they used to be in the factories, working, creating maybe different, ammunition, etc., and different equipment for the soldiers to go use in the war. So that was that. Obviously we have things such as, on Christmas Day, Germany and England decided to put everything on hold and, play the game of football, which, was actually pretty nice to see, from both countries, to be like, we're not fighting today, we're going to play a game of football and, be peaceful about it, etc. So that was another, positive impact that sport had even on a war. So we had things such as technology as well that managed to improve during the 20th century with the introduction of TVs and phones. Having a mobile phone obviously did help. Let's say you had your own club, or whether you could always get in contact with someone else or a different club and maybe set up friendly games, have that sort of competition there and play for something and get more experience, playing against different people, different clubs, get more experience and hopefully find weaknesses in your game to work on and improve, etc. And obviously the introduction of TVs was quite big as well, because now, let's say you couldn't travel to a game because I don't know, maybe you couldn't afford to go travel or you were busy. You could always catch the game on TV and still watch your favourite team or your favourite sport from home, rather than having to travel however many hours or however far it was to go watch it live in person. However, obviously, TVs might have been quite pricey back then, so some lower class people might not have had the money to be able to afford them, whereas higher class obviously probably had no problem affording the TV because they were a lot richer than the lower class. But it was still positive to have another option rather than having to travel to a game where you can just sit at home and watch it. And obviously nowadays it's even bigger. Most people probably prefer watching it at home rather than having to spend a lot of money on tickets to go watch it live. But it was very helpful in the 20th century for sure. We also have the introduction of better travel modes of transport. So we have planes, cars and buses being invented, which again very, very useful. Obviously planes, if you want to go abroad, maybe set up a friendly game, etc. with a team abroad, you can always go and do that and travel there to go and play them. And obviously fans being able to travel and follow their team and watch them. Obviously not everyone could afford a plane back then, which was you had easier, cheaper options such as the buses and the cars for the lower class as well. So it was a wider range of modes of transport, which were some were much more affordable than others, which was helpful for even the lower class if they wanted to travel. Now they could get a bus, go to see your favourite team, etc. So that was pretty helpful. So yeah, buses, all these modes being introduced definitely helped increase the spectatorship as well within sport, due to the fact that more people could now travel there and watch it live. So moving on to the last one, we have the history and the development of football. So this is more about the key organisations that are involved and how the sport has developed from the beginning to the modern day. So one of the big governing bodies for football, especially in England, is the FA, which was actually introduced on the 26th of October in 1863, which actually makes it the oldest governing body in the world. So that is the FA is a huge governing body, which obviously deals with all the leagues in England, etc., and provides obviously money and everything to schools to help have better equipment for the chosen sports or football, and maybe even set up talks, etc., with different ex-professional football players or even current professional football players. Go talk to kids, which helps inspire kids even from a young age. Being able to have someone that was a professional football player or that is still playing now, speak to them and talk to them about football, etc. So they help out a lot. But with football, obviously they introduced one of the biggest competitions in England, the FA Cup, which was quite big. It was created in November of 1871, and this has now teams all the way from the Premier League all the way down to National League and semi-pro, etc. So there's loads and loads and loads of teams from England that can compete in this competition, and it's always a nice competition, and you can get an underdog story where like a National League team goes and plays a Premier League team or whatever, even manages to knock them out. That'll be great for the team, but definitely gives the smaller teams obviously funds. The higher round you get to, the more money you get for the club, but obviously popularity and to make a name for yourself. So that's the beauty of the competition, and it's a very big one in England. So we have Ebenezer Cobb Morley, who was elected as the secretary of the FA, and he presented 23 draft rules on the 24th of November in 1863. Some of these rules were things such as after a goal is scored, the team that conceded the goal will have to go back to kick-off, but also every time a goal was scored, the teams had to change ends, which obviously is very different now, since you don't have to do that after every goal is scored. But it's now every half, obviously 2 halves, at half time teams switch ends. However, obviously the kick-off rule is still in place. If you concede a goal, you go back to kick-off and restart the game again. Another big rule was, the introduction of offsides, which was, put in place in 1866. So this was very helpful, for sure. It definitely changed the game to what it is now, because back then, without the offside, people could, like goal hang, you just sit by the goal and just wait for the ball to be played to you, and try and get easy tap-ins, etc., or easy one-on-ones with the goalkeeper. Whereas now you have to be in line or in front of the last defender, otherwise if you're behind him it will be flagged as offside if the ball gets past you. So it definitely improved the game in a way, but also changed teams' tactics and the way they play, etc. So that was pretty useful. Definitely a good change and a good rule put in place. Another one was obviously the fact that you can't use your hands if you're not a goalkeeper or you're doing a throw-in, etc. So if you're an outfield player, you can't literally just pick the ball up and just run with the ball in your hands. Obviously you play with your feet, etc. You can obviously use your head to score headers or chest for a touch, etc. But you can't use your hands unless you're a goalkeeper or you have a throw-in. The other governing body that is quite big for football is UEFA, which was invented on the 15th of June in 1954 in Switzerland, and it was made up of 31 founding associations, which include teams such as countries such as France, Italy, etc. And obviously, UEFA is quite a big and created competitions such as the Champions League, which we know now is one of the greatest competitions in the world. And every team in Europe wants to fight for it and wants to fight for that trophy. And again, like the FA Cup, because there's such a wide range of teams, literally from all across Europe, once again, you have the chance to make a name for yourself if you're a smaller team. Again, you get funds for it the higher you progress. So, that's a good financial income and, increase for your club if you're a smaller club. And obviously, if you manage to knock out a big team, like your Barcelona, Bayern Munich, etc., you can make an even bigger name for yourself. So we have the Champions League, which was actually invented in 1955, and then about 20 years later we have the Europa League, which was invented in 1971. Obviously, nowadays Champions League, is better, or more people think the Champions League is bigger than the Europa League. But obviously both great achievements if you manage to win it. So, there was obviously some big competitions introduced by UEFA, which, definitely helped, create more of a competitiveness again in football. Your club has a different, target or goal to go for now, with, more competitions being introduced, and, you're fighting for an even bigger trophy, and to be able to be crowned the champion of Europe, which is a big name to have for your club. And lastly, about the sport, developed from the beginning, all the way to the modern day. Obviously back then you had what was known as mob football, which was you go from one village to the other and you have to try and score, and it was very, very violent. People even ended up dying from it, etc., from like severe injuries picked up during that process. And it was literally one village going up against the other village. Obviously now it's a lot different. It's 11 players on one team, 11 players on the other. There are 45-minute halves, and it's whoever can outscore each other in that 90 minutes, plus maybe added time, extra time, etc. Whereas back then it was whoever can get to the other team's goal first used to win the game. So obviously, with the introduction of new rules, going back to even the public schools with Thomas Arnold, making it more structured and creating less of a violent game, and introducing different rules and house systems and all that. And then obviously going forward in time, you have different governing bodies like the FA, UEFA, FIFA, etc., which put different rules in as well, different rules in place, which have definitely changed the game now. So things such as offside, handball, penalties, referees being introduced as well to ref the games. It gives it more of a structure, more professionalism in the sport as well. So the players just can't do whatever they want. You have to listen to the referee, who has to make decisions on controversial stuff in the game, which can sometimes be difficult. Which is why thanks to technology improving, we now have things such as the VAR being introduced and goal line technology, because obviously we know about how England missed out on the Euros or the World Cup, because of the goal not counting when video proves that it did go over the line. So obviously goal line technology back then would have probably meant that England were champions